are growing our bookstores. Not the actual bookstores, just the space they're in. Thank you guys for coming to see me. Wow. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do the same thing I generally do, which is first I'm going to make you listen to me blab. Okay? This is Professor Sanderson going off on what he's interested in. Right now, it's going to be a talk, maybe 15 minutes or so, about the intersection of Heraclitus and Chinese spaghetti. So look forward to that. It's whatever's on my mind at the moment. After that, I'll do a Q&A. And I might steal a chair and stand on it so some of you back there can see me better for the Q&A portion. And I will repeat all the questions for those of you in the other room who can't hear. When the questions are asked, we'll make sure that you get to hear what the questions are. I will blab about answers to those. And then after that, we'll do a reading. Okay? So we'll be reading from the new thing that I'm working on, which is listed as secret project on my website. So, it's something new. I'll tell you the story of how it came about in a little bit. But first, Chinese spaghetti. So this actually starts not with the actual spaghetti part or the Greek philosophy part. It starts with my son Oliver. Oliver is 5 years old now, but this story happens when he was 3-year-old. And my children are very cute. Yes, I have 3 little boys. They are very cute, and I can't help telling stories about them. And when I came down the steps, and Oliver didn't see me. He was sitting at the kitchen table. He was playing with his toys, little trucks. And it was the cutest thing ever. He was driving the trucks around, and they were like asking each other if they wanted to go to get ice cream, and then they drive and get ice cream, and they'd eat the ice cream, and then they drive back. And it was one of those, parental moments where you're like, okay, all of this is worth it, right? All the troubles are worth being able to stand here without him even knowing I'm there and watching as he just plays with those little trucks. He lined them all up in a row. It was really cute. And then he said, "If you like this video, please hit subscribe." I'm serious. He said, "Like me on Facebook. Please leave a comment in the comment section." And the room was empty. He wasn't recording this. He was just, this is how he thought you played, because he had been watching YouTube videos of people playing with toys, and that's how you get done playing. As you say, please hit subscribe. Which was, at the same time, really, really amusing to me. I wish I had it on video. He wouldn't do it when I got out the camera and said, "Say that again." He's like, "No." But you're really doing a video this time. No. But it also kind of made me kind of confront how different his life is from my life, and set me in kind of a bout of nostalgia for things that had happened years ago. Like, for instance, Oliver, he is named after James Oliver Rigney, Robert Jordan. And he was born, I think, 9 days before A Memory of Light released. Or maybe A Memory of Light, no, Memory of Light released right before he was born. That's what it was. Either way, I went on tour about 2 weeks later. So if you ever meet my wife, tell her she's a saint, because she put up with me going on tour for Wheel of Time fans when she had a 2-week-old baby. But I was thinking about Oliver and about about the Wheel of Time and about growing up as a fantasy writer, trying to break in. And I got very nostalgic for some of these things. Like when my life is very different now than it used to be. My life is pretty awesome now. You guys all came to see me. This is really cool. I can still remember the days of trying to break in. There were 3 of us that we would go to science fiction cons together, trying to find out how to become published writers. It was myself, Dan Wells, who writes teen fiction and thrillers and horror books and things, and Peter Ahlstrom, who is now my assistant, but back then he really wanted to become an editor. He still is an editor, but what he wanted to go be a science fiction book editor. And we would go to these conventions, and we were dirt poor, right? We were poor college students. We would all have to get 6 of us in one room or things like this. And we would go to these conventions, and we would hunt editors. Now, if you want to see someone get scared of you, hold a manuscript and go looking for editors. They are the ones that bolt for, behind the counter and things when they see someone walking up with their manuscript. And our whole goal at these conventions was to find editors and get them to talk to us and agree to read our manuscripts, right? We did this. We went to con after con. We actually eventually came up with a really cool idea. You see, the editors would run from us, but we found if we walked up to them and said, "Our friend Peter wants to be an editor," they would reach out their arm around his shoulders and say, "Oh, you poor, poor boy." They would be like, "Oh, you poor child, you want to be an editor. Oh, it's so horrible, the authors never listen to us. We have to live in Manhattan, which is awesome, but nobody pays us any money." So they would just go off about how awful being an editor was, despite how much they all seemed to really like it at the same time. Maybe it's because editors or authors are always hunting them down with manuscripts. But then they would turn to the rest of us, to myself and Dan, and they would say, "Oh, do you poor souls want to be editors too?" And we'd say, "No, we're writers. Here's our manuscripts." Right? But then they were trapped in a conversation with us already. It was great. We called it Petering people, right? Really, it worked really well. We petered Tom Doherty, who founded Tor. Even though he was a publisher and didn't do any editorial, we cornered him with Peter, and even he's like, "Oh, you poor, poor boy." And it worked really well. And I was thinking about this, and I was being really nostalgic for it. And then I stopped, and I realized, why are you nostalgic for those days? Those days sucked, right? You didn't know what you were if you're gonna be able to do this writing thing for a living. You had written by that point I'd written 11 or 12 novels and hadn't sold any. My parents were convinced I would end up at the side of the road begging for beans or whatever. My life is way better now, yet I was nostalgic. And this has been a big theme that people have been talking about lately, nostalgia. What is the place of nostalgia what is the place for it in kind of storytelling and fiction and pop culture? How much of what we enjoy is just influenced by having liked that thing once when we were younger and things like this? And this is where I've been thinking several months about the stocks. This is where I kind of went down the Greek philosopher route, because I really, I have a philosophy minor, so I end up doing this. That's the only career choice you could do that was less useful than being a creative writing major, so I had to do both, right? Nah, that's okay. There's lots of room for, he said ouch, which was fine. There's plenty of space for philosophers, right? So Heraclitus, I don't know if you know him. He's one of my favorites. He's famous for a philosophy called "everything flows," is kind of how we would put it. You might know it better as a phrase he once said, which is, "You can never step in the same river twice." Pocahontas, right? Kind of, she said it too, but it was Heraclitus. That's his philosophy, is this idea that you can't ever step in the same river twice because the river is always changing. The water is washing away the banks and making it into a different shape. It is different water. Everything flows. The world is constantly changing, and this is a good thing, right? This is a valuable thing. It's kind of the point of this philosophy, and I believe this. This actually does relate, I promise you, because it relates to the Stormlight Archive, the book that you guys are holding now. A lot of people ask me, where do you get your ideas? And so I try to organize these little speech things as extended explanations of where some of my ideas came from. And one of the very early ideas for the Stormlight Archive was for soul casting. Which I was just calling forging at that point, because it's a long story. I ended up using that somewhere else. But soul casting, this idea in the Stormlight Archive of transforming one thing into another. In fact, originally, when I first kind of came up with the idea and was working on it, every Order of Knight Radiant would be able to soul cast. But only using certain materials. So every one of them, their powers would involve transforming. and it's just what they could transform things into and what they could use. And eventually, I felt that got a little, it just wasn't working, and I changed it. But this idea of transformation, of change, was a central theme for the series as I was building it. I liked this underpinning of the story was going to be about the transformations of these characters, and the magic would reinforce that by the magic having its focal point being transformation, one thing becoming another. I've talked about this before, but I just love the era in our world where people started applying the scientific method to superstition. I love things like alchemy. I love things like, when you go back and you look at people like Isaac Newton saying, hey, does this actually work? Can we transform things into other things using, certain materials? How does this work? Can we make alchemy work? I love that stuff. That intersection between superstition and science is like, that's where my mind often goes, and that was the origin of the magic system in Rochards. This idea that everything must change. In fact, you look at when a lot of the discussion of alchemy was happening. It was happening during probably the most famous nostalgia trip of all time. We call it the Renaissance, right? And I can't help but think that these ideas were clashing even then. The idea of, well, we should go back to the way things were before versus, hey, everything is changing. And I can see that in my own life, right? Change is a little bit scary. The way things went before might have been bad. I might have had to cram with 6 other people into a hotel room and things like this, but I've done it already, so it's familiar. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe, I don't know. One of these trips, while I was actually working on Stormlight, the first version in 2002, which wasn't good enough to publish, I actually trashed it and started over. But there's some, I'll eventually release it. There's some fun things. Everybody has different names, but you can figure out who they are. Dalinar doesn't have a different name. He's still Dalinar, but while I was working on that book, we went to World Fantasy Convention in Montreal, and we had gotten really good at petering people by that point. And we had gotten really good at stalking editors. In fact, Dan Wells, who I mentioned earlier, he was really, really, really good at stalking people. To the point that when he started writing books about serial killers, we are all like, yeah. That makes perfect sense. Of course that's what you would do, Dan. Why did you think of this before? You're so good at stalking people. And at this convention, we were hunting a specific editor named Moshe Fader. See, what we had learned is if we went to people like short magazine editors, like short fiction editors for magazines, or people who ran workshops and stuff, people who were connected to editors of books but who weren't scared of us, they would be like, oh yeah, you should totally talk to this person because they've just started acquiring, they don't know to be scared of you yet. I'm making it sound much more like the editors are scared of them. They're really not. They're very nice people. They do want to read your manuscripts. They just get a little overwhelmed at conventions. But they'd say this editor, they said Moshe, this one. Moshe has just started acquiring. He's hungry for new authors. You guys should find him. And so we said, all right, Dan, go. And he spent the rest of the convention using certain means we won't talk about to find out who this Moshe person was, and eventually tracked him down at a party on the last night of the convention at like midnight. And we surrounded him, we petered him, he just started talking, and then he just went off. He's like, oh, you're authors, that's great, tell me about your books. We both got to pitch to him, he was really engaged and interested and things like this, and he became the editor who bought my first book. And so it has a kind of a happy ending there. If you can't tell by the fact that I am, there's way too many of you here to buy my books now, it's worked out. Yay. This is where the story comes to what I warned about before, this idea of Chinese spaghetti. What do I mean by that? Well, after we had this big conversation with Moshe, we wanted to go to dinner, but it was 2 a.m. But we were hyped. We're like, we've spent this whole con, we found this person, he liked our pitches, he told us to send him manuscripts, He did eventually buy a book from Dan too, so it went really well. So we were excited. We wanted to go out to eat. And Dan and I just kind of, as we tend to do, just pulled Peter along with us and went to this one place we found that was open. It was this Italian restaurant that had really good calzones we'd tried before. We sat down, we were looking at the menus, the place was empty, it's 2 a.m., but for some reason they were still open. And Peter, meanwhile, is like, you know, guys, I don't really like Italian food. We're like, just you find something to like. And so we both ordered our calzones, and the waiter came over, who was also the chef, said, so, what do you guys want? And Peter's like, and the guy just was kind of a little forceful. What do you want? What do you want? And he said, well, I really want Chinese food. Which is a very Peter line to say. If you ever meet him, you can ask him about this. It's very amusing. But the guy snatched his menu out of his hand and said, great, I'll make you some Chinese spaghetti. And we're like, huh? And so the guy runs in the back, comes out with 2 calzones and stir-fried spaghetti with jajang sauce on it. So it's kind of really Korean spaghetti, but you know, it looked really unappealing, right? Like I don't know if any of you guys know jajang sauce, but it's kind of like motor oil. It's actually really tasty, but it looks like motor oil that you like dump on noodles or rice or something like that. And so it stir-fried a bunch of Italian vegetables, thrown in spaghetti, but then poured in jajang sauce. And we looked at this plate and we're like, ugh. But then Peter tried it and he's like, wow, this is one of the best things I've ever eaten. And I tried it too. It was great. It was fantastic. It was really, really amazing. And this does relate because Chinese spaghetti, it sent me into thinking about something else Heraclitus said. Which was actually one of my favorite things he ever kind of talked about, which is the idea that all things come into being through the conflict of opposites. This was like a core center of his philosophy. All things exist through the conflict of opposites, which is kind of a writing principle too. Because in my life at that time, I was really trying to decide how did I want to have my own voice, and how much did I want to use what had come before. There's this constant tug of war in writing fiction between what we call the familiar and the strange. It's very famous that, you know, in Hollywood, people will use this idea, the tug between the familiar and the strange. They'll name 2 familiar things, and the strange is the combination of them, right? So when people say things like, oh yes, it's like Superman meets My Fair Lady, right? You're like, oh, I know what those 2 things are, but the intersection, what is that? That's why those pitches kind of work, because you get the familiar and strange, and every writer kind of has to make this decision for themselves. I was working on Stormlight, and I love big, thick, epic fantasy books, if you can't tell. Right? By the fact that me coming up with longer and longer books that the publisher has to scramble to figure out how to publish. But at the same time, I felt that a lot of the books that I had been reading had done a really good job of epic fantasy. And the question to myself became, what do I add to this genre to make it interesting? How do I stake a claim with my own voice versus how much do I put into things that I just know I love? And this is kind of I think a really true principle, this idea that often the combination of unexpected things, the conflict of opposites, spaghetti and Chinese food being mixed together, is where innovation happens. And for that sort of thing to happen, change has to occur, right? Without change, we don't go anywhere. This is actually, this is a big deal, and I don't think I can do it justice in a goofy little talk. But if you think about it, almost every world religion has change as a major aspect of its spirituality. Whether it's something more like Buddhist, where you're looking inward and changing yourself to become something enlightened, or whether it's more Judeo-Christian, where you're looking toward an all-powerful figure to help you up past your flaws. The concept is change. You will change and become something else through the course of spiritual progress. But it's not just a spiritual idea, right? It's a secular idea. The whole concept of the theory of evolution is that over time, small random changes encourage a species to adapt to its setting. And without those changes, species stagnate and vanish. And it is those changes that makes it possible for everything to happen. It's a storytelling concept. And indeed, if you kind of look at a lot of the classic science fiction and fantasy stories out there, one of the big things that the villains often want is immortality. It's what Voldemort wanted, right? This idea of the magic MacGuffin that will make it so I never have to change again is what I want to have. This is where the vampire mythos comes from. This is, immortality in exchange for basically never having to change. And that's generally presented in fiction as a bad thing. So what is this idea of nostalgia? Where is the place for this? Is there a place for this? We want to look backward at the same time we want to look forward. Can we do that? Again, I don't know if I can approach this concept, but as I was really looking at it and digging into it, looking at myself, why I looked backward and things like this, it really came to realize to me that this idea of we can never step in the same river twice is true for more than one reason. Because we can never step in the same river because we're never the same person. You step in that river, next time you come across it, you are a different person. And it's just not just a ship of Theseus. I always say that name wrong. It's not just a ship of Theseus thing. Like we're not just ourselves dying and new ones being born. We change, we progress, we go down different paths. And it feels like to me that there is a point of nostalgia, there is a point of looking backward, if only because if we can't look backward, we can't see what it is we've become, right? We can't see that journey, and if we can't see how much we've changed, then that change loses a big part of its meaning, at least to me. And so this idea of change, of looking back, I think nostalgia's okay. I think as long as we frame it in a certain way, look back and see where what you've become. See where life is taking you. See how much you've grown and how much you've changed when you do look backward. Don't just look back and say, oh, that was better. Look back and say, wow, look at what I am now. Look at what I've become. And so that's where my mind is right now. Please hit subscribe. Like me on Facebook. Give me the Insta thingy or whatever. Snapbook me. And if you ever see Oliver, tell him that you know he's the cutest kid who's ever existed. Thank you guys for that. That's the speech part. I guess I warned you, these are kind of goofy sometimes, so maybe that'll form a little bit of your understanding of why I write the things I do in the Stormlight Archive, where some of the concepts came from, not just the magic system, but kind of the whole shebang.